Meghan is starting to realize Harry is not all that, and she's going to have to go her own way and pursue a sort of Jeff Bezos type of character.
Meghan Markle is losing it. And the specific sequence of events building toward that conclusion is something the headlines have completely missed. This isn't just about divorce rumors. It's about staff walking out, legal bills mounting, Harry reportedly eyeing a return to Britain, and something quietly fracturing at the center of a marriage that was supposed to be unbreakable. The surface story is noise. What's actually happening underneath is far more serious and far more irreversible. This is how Meghan Markle is losing it as divorce looms and Prince Harry is left broke by a huge legal bill. In early 2025, OK magazine published what it called a secret divorce plan between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. The details were specific enough to sound credible. The sourcing was exactly what you'd expect, one unnamed royal insider. And then Vanity Fair published a piece timed to the 5th anniversary of the Sussexes stepping back from royal duties, and buried inside it was something genuinely interesting. A member of Meghan's team had quietly approached publishers. The person allegedly made clear the couple were not splitting, but they asked the question anyway. That distinction matters less than the fact that someone in her orbit was already running the scenario. Harry, for his part, wasn't having it. At a December 2024 appearance, he said on the record, "We've apparently divorced maybe 10, 12 times, so it's just like, what?" Mockery delivered with the practiced exhaustion of someone who has watched this story get recycled for years. But then something actually happened, something verifiable, and that is where the meltdown narrative found its footing. In December 2025, two of the most senior people inside the Sussex operation walked out at the same time. Their chief U.S. publicist, gone. The executive director of the Archewell Foundation, gone simultaneously. Both departures landed within the same short window, which is not the rhythm of an organization running smoothly. What happened next is where interpretation took over from evidence. A source described to Radar as an insider told the outlet that Meghan was, quote, in full meltdown mode, blaming everyone around her, Harry included. And here is what sources genuinely suggest. Stripped of the tabloid framing, two high-level departures in a single month from the communications operation and the foundation's executive structure signal something real. You do not lose your publicist and your executive director in the same breath by accident. Whether the cause was internal tension, strategic disagreement, or something more specific, sources close to the organization have not said. What they have said, carefully, is that staff continuity around the Sussexes has been a recurring problem. Nearly 25 departures by some tallies. That pattern is documented. So, the meltdown claim rests on a single anonymous proximity quote dropped onto a genuinely unusual institutional event. Nothing individually dispositive. Everything collectively suggestive. But the real question the December exits raised had nothing to do with Meghan's temperament. It had to do with money. Specifically, what it actually cost to keep this entire operation running when the legal bills are still arriving. Harry has been engaged in two significant pieces of litigation tied to the British press. The first is his lawsuit against Associated Newspapers, the publisher behind the BA Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday, centered on alleged unlawful information gathering. The second is the MGN phone hacking case, which reached a settlement in January 2024. Harry was one of the few claimants who pursued that case to the absolute wire rather than settling early, a decision sources suggest was as much about principle as it was about money. UK litigation of this complexity is expensive, and that Harry's decision to fight rather than settle early in the MGN case meant his legal exposure accumulated over years, not weeks. The MGN settlement itself was publicly acknowledged. That gap between public acknowledgement and confirmed figures is where the invented precision lives, where sources suggest significant costs quietly becomes. Harry spent $30 million on lawsuits by the time it reaches the third rewrite. What is genuinely verifiable is this. The litigation was lengthy, it was contested, and Harry bore the costs personally rather than through any institutional backing. And that is the part that matters structurally. Because the legal exposure did not exist in isolation, it sat on top of an income picture that the headline numbers made look far more comfortable than sources close to the actual figures suggest it really was. So what did the Netflix deal, the Spotify contract, and the Penguin Random House advance actually deliver once the real accounting was done? That number is considerably more complicated than the press releases made it sound. So the legal costs were real, they were personal, and they landed on a financial foundation that looked far more solid from the outside than it actually was. Start with the Penguin Random House advance for spare. The figure that circulated at the time of the deal was somewhere in the region of $20 million, and sources close to publishing suggest that number is not entirely fictional. But here is what the press coverage consistently left out. Advances of that size are almost never paid in a single transfer. They come in tranches. Each tranche gets taxed. Agent fees come off the top. Then there are the costs of producing the memoir itself, the ghostwriter, the legal review, the security considerations that go into writing a book that names living members of the royal family. The Netflix deal is more complicated. The reported value was around $100 million over multiple projects. But sources familiar with the structure describe it less as a guaranteed payout and more as a production commitment with performance conditions attached. The Sussex documentary landed well. The Polo series that followed generated noticeably less attention. Netflix has been quietly recalibrating what it expects from the partnership in terms of scale and investment, which directly affects what flows back. Then there is Spotify. The deal was reportedly worth around $18 million. It was also terminated in 2023 after Archetypes completed its first season. One Spotify executive was quoted describing the partnership in terms that were not exactly glowing. Whatever the final settlement figure was on that exit, it was not the full contracted value. What was actually happening inside Archewell while the income picture was getting complicated? Archewell Foundation's 2022 tax return, the most recent filing available for independent scrutiny at the time the staff departures hit the news, showed total grant-making of approximately $13 million. But sources familiar with nonprofit operations note that a foundation of Archewell's stated ambitions and public profile would typically sustain or grow that figure year over year. Instead, reported donor hesitancy began circulating in philanthropic circles as early as mid-2024, suggesting the institutional appetite for underwriting the Sussex brand had quietly softened. The executive director's exit in December 2025 then becomes something other than a personnel footnote. That role is not administrative. It manages donor relationships, grant strategy, and the operational credibility that keeps major contributors engaged. Losing that position simultaneously with the chief publicist is not a coincidence of timing. It is the kind of double departure that sends a specific signal to anyone watching from the philanthropic sector. The question that raises is obvious. Were donors pulling back because of the personal drama narrative? Or was the personal drama narrative partly a symptom of institutional pressure? Both were feeding each other. Nothing individually collapses the institution. But collectively, the pattern is genuinely difficult to reverse. Which brings the question to Harry himself. Because, while Archewell wobbles as an institution, what has Harry actually been doing professionally? And the answer is more revealing than anyone expected. While Archewell's filings tell one story, Harry's public professional record over the last 18 months tells a completely different one. Harry appeared at a Beverly Hills property and real estate conference in early 2024, a commercial real estate conference. Sources close to the situation describe the appearance as genuinely confusing internally, the kind of booking that happens when a team is casting around for relevance rather than executing a strategy. Then there was the Polo documentary. Netflix, competently made, genuinely niche. The viewing figures were not what anyone involved had positioned them to be. And then the podcast moment. Harry, in a recorded conversation, described what he does for Archewell in terms so broad and undefined that multiple commentators noted it sounded less like a job description and more like someone still working out what the job actually is. None of these individually constitutes a crisis, but collectively, they describe a man genuinely, completely untethered from the institutional structure that gave his public identity coherence. The royal framework, military service, the official engagements, those were not merely ceremonial props, they were the scaffolding. Without them, Harry has been quietly searching for a replacement architecture that simply has not materialized. That purposelessness matters because it directly affects the financial picture, the Archewell picture, and the marriage strain picture. A man without clear professional footing is not a stable co-architect of any shared institution. Which raises the question nobody in this story has been willing to answer publicly yet. Has the palace noticed? And more importantly, have they quietly decided to do something about it? And that is exactly the question this whole story has been building toward. The answer is yes. And what they appear to have done about it is far more calculated than anyone in the Sussex camp publicly anticipated. In early 2025, sources close to the palace indicate that a quiet meeting took place at Highgrove, the king's private estate, involving a small circle of senior advisors, not a press-managed reconciliation photo opportunity, something considerably more discreet. The agenda was narrow and deliberately kept off any official calendar. What role, if any, could Harry occupy that served the institution without destabilizing it further? That conversation produced something more concrete than anyone expected. A Buckingham Palace offer, not announced through the usual press machinery, but described as a structured framework for Harry to re-engage with selective royal duties on a basis that stopped well short of full working royal status. The personnel signal that followed is genuinely telling. Clive Alderson, who had been handling elements of the Sussex adjacent communications architecture, was quietly replaced by Theo Reifkogel, a figure considerably more palace-aligned in his operational instincts. Personnel changes at this level are never accidental. They are almost always the footprint of a directional decision already made by people further up. And here is where the divorce narrative suddenly inverts. Because if the palace is genuinely opening a door, the real question is not whether Harry and Meghan are falling apart. The question is whether Harry walks through that door alone, which is the choice that makes or breaks everything that follows. The verified facts, stacked in sequence, actually point in a specific direction. The distinction matters enormously to how the named parties at the top of this equation, William, Charles, and the Sussexes themselves, come out on the other side. For a genuine return to relevance within any palace-adjacent framework, both Harry and Meghan would need to move together, not symbolically, operationally. That means Meghan accepting constraints she has completely resisted since 2020. It means Harry accepting a subordinate position inside an institution he is very publicly accused of institutional failures. And it means William has been the harder wall to move, finding a version of this he can explain to the public without undermining his own standing as heir. That is a genuinely high bar, and there is currently no verified evidence that all three conditions exist simultaneously. But the financial desperation angle, which is the other scenario, has its own logic. The gap between the headline deal figures and what actually landed in accounts, the Archewell Foundation's documented wobble, and Harry's legal exposure collectively create a pressure environment that makes a return to relevance more attractive than it was in 2022. Quietly accepting reduced terms from a palace that is deliberately signaling openness is a different calculation than it was when the money was still flowing cleanly. And here's what makes this genuinely interesting. The palace's directional decision, flagged by that personnel shift of Theo Reifkogel, appears calibrated for Harry, not for both of them. Which means Charles and William have done the arithmetic. They know what a Harry-only return looks like institutionally. They know what it does to Meghan's leverage position, and they appear to have made a choice accordingly. This is not a reconciliation offer. It is something considerably more surgical than that. Which means the question that actually drives everything now is not whether the marriage survives. It is what each of them is worth individually, to the institution, to the deals, and to each other, and what the answer to that question actually costs. So let's be precise about what the end would actually mean. A Sussex divorce does not automatically strip either of them. Harry remains a duke. Meghan, under precedent, would likely lose the Duchess title upon remarriage, but not immediately upon separation. Sources close to constitutional analysts note the palace retains discretionary authority here, and given that the personnel shift toward Reifkogel appears calibrated for Harry specifically, the institution has already signaled which title it considers worth protecting. Then there is security. Harry's Metropolitan Police protection was withdrawn in 2020. Any pathway back toward royal proximity, even a partial, managed one, reattaches that question directly to his personal status. A divorce severs that pathway completely. He would be genuinely alone on that front, funding private security from a litigation-depleted estate. The Netflix deal is the third structural domino. The current arrangement is built on the Sussex brand as a unit. Internal conversations at Netflix have already touched on what a solo Meghan content slate looks like versus a joint one. The answer is considerably less valuable. And for the institution itself, a Sussex divorce is quietly the cleanest outcome imaginable. It removes Meghan from the equation without the palace lifting a finger, which is precisely why sources cannot confirm whether anyone inside those walls is genuinely trying to prevent it. And that is the one question no source has yet answered. Not whether the marriage ends, but whether the people with the power to slow this down have already decided not to. The power has shifted. Harry's broke, Meghan's isolated, and the marriage hangs on a rumor nobody can kill. The real story isn't divorce, it's leverage, and whoever blinks first loses everything. Who holds that card?